So for years, Dr. Munroe was leading the revolution in the Bahamas and eventually the world in terms of ministry, and I was leading the revolution in youth ministry. So we were working together as a team and walking a parallel path. After a while, he began to travel. He started traveling, and as he began to travel, in the early days, he traveled with a team here from BFM, and every now and then he would say to me, come go with me on a trip. And I would go with him on a trip, and we would go together and hang out. And in those early days, before he was really famous, when we went on a trip, we stayed in the same room, we hung out together, and we would go and do meetings and hang out all night, and when we got together after the meetings in the hotel room, he would talk until 5 o'clock in the morning. And so we had fun, we had fun hanging together. And then eventually what he started doing is, when we would go places, he'd say, Dave, look, whenever I have to speak, I want you to speak before I do. I'll give you 10 minutes and you could just share. And so, we went to places like, Los Angeles, we went to Tampa, we went to Louisiana, we went to New York, we went to Baltimore, we went to all of these places, and we would be hanging out together, and, I would be speaking just before he spoke. I'd share my testimony, and then people started to be attracted to me, and it opened up doors for me. So he opened up a lot of doors for me. And we had so many fun, interesting experiences. I'll tell you one of the really funny experiences that we had. I remember we were in Baltimore and we were doing a meeting together, and I gave my testimony, and we were going back to the hotel. And while we were walking back to the hotel, there was this limo on the outside of the hotel. And as we were walking close to the limo, the window rolled down. And when the window rolled down, the guy who was in the limo, he looked up at Dr. Munroe, and he said, hey man, don't I know you? And so Dr. Munroe looked at me and he said, who's that? So I said, oh man, that's Nate Dogg. So Nate Dogg said, yeah man, I watch you on TBN. And I was like, wow, it's hard to believe that Nate Dogg would watch Dr. Munroe, but it just told you about the influence that he had. So he signed the book for Nate Dogg, and then we went in the hotel, and I remember they were doing a movie in the hotel, and we were in the elevator, and in the elevator was Bernie Mac. And we went upstairs, Bernie Mac, and then when we went to we were staying on the concierge level, and then when we went into the concierge lounge, I was sitting there eating my food, and then there was Robin Givens, but I didn't know she was Robin Givens, and I was sitting down talking to this lady, and I said, boy, you look a lot like Robin Givens. And then she said, hey, I am Robin Givens. So we had a lot of fun times on the road. We hung out together, and then eventually he began to write books. And as he began to write books, he said to me, Dave, what you have, the expertise that you have in youth ministry, you don't have any black pastors or youth pastors with material. He said, the same way I'm writing books, you need to write books. And so then I started writing books. So I wrote Making the Most of Your Teenage Years, Strategies for Saving the Next Generation, Talk to Me. And he also hooked me up with his publishers. So my first few books were published by the same publishers that published his books. So it was Destiny Image, it was Pneuma Life. And so we were walking this journey together. He allowed me to flourish in my lane. And eventually, in addition to books, I started traveling on my own. He started traveling on his own. So we would travel together sometimes, but then I was doing my own thing as well. And all along the way, he kept encouraging me. And then I remember him coming and saying to me, he said, okay, now, Dave, it's time for you to get ordained. And I was like, dude, I'm not into this pastor stuff. I don't want to be ordained. And he was like, well, after I refused a couple of times, he pulled me in. He said, Dave, let me ask you a question. He said, do you counsel people? I said, yeah. He said, do you preach? I said, yeah. And then he gave me a list of things. And when he asked me, all the answers were yeah. So he said, well, you're a pastor. He said, why are you denying it? And it was at that time that I said, okay, Chief, you know, I'll go to the ordination. So I went to the ordination. I became the youth pastor officially. And, you know, we continued on different paths. I started my own ministry in different areas, started traveling to the US, Canada, the Caribbean, and you know, just my books began to flourish, my videos, and then we entered the next phase of ministry, which was, you know, after being the youth pastor, I also started my own television program. He had a television program. I had a television program for youth. I had a radio program. And all along the way, he was encouraging me. You know, I was the secretary to the board of Bahamas Faith Ministry since its inception. So we were on the board together. And we had this group that began together, that was together at that time for 15, 20 years. Myself, Pastor Myles, Pastor Richard, Pastor Henry, and Pastor Jay. Were all together, and you know, we used to have all of these meetings all the time, and we were always planning for the future. You know, like any family, we had our issues and you know, disagreements and so on, but it was a family that stayed together. You know, people always looked at us and they said, well, Pastor Dave, how could you all stay together? At the time of his death, it was like 37 years. And it was that relationship that we built in the beginning that kept us together. It was also being unified to the vision. We all believed in the vision. And another thing that I thought was very important was the fact that Dr. Munroe always tried to deploy people rather than employ people. So if he saw that you had a gift, he didn't say, well, hold your gift down because it's going to interfere with my gift. He said, no, whatever you have, I want you to release it and expand it, because what you do, I don't do. And I always appreciated that. So, you know, it really caused my ministry to expand and flourish. I ended up becoming a consultant for youth ministries. I ended up, you know, having major engagements, and many places that he went, he would recommend me, because sometimes, you know, I would go somewhere that he just came from and they say, yeah, you know, Dr. Munroe was here and he just talked about you. So we continued on our relationship together, and you know, the journey saw great impact in the Bahamas, and then a great global impact. And then eventually, as I began to transition in ministry, you know, I had been in youth ministry for a lot of years. I had been working together with Dr. Munroe, Dr. Pinder. We had been working together for a long time. I began to transition out of youth ministry. So as I began to transition out of youth ministries, Dr. Munroe and I, we had some talks, and he was like, Dave, you know, what area of the ministry, you know, can I use you in? And at that time, in his mind, it was, you know, to eventually become the, you know, pastor of the church. And to the point where he actually kind of announced it in one of our meetings. And at that time I said, Chief, no, I can't do it because I don't want to be a senior pastor. And he said, no, man, you know, you'll be okay. But I said, no, you know, that's not me. You know, I don't want to do it. And so he said, okay, and he left me alone. And then we started to have some other talks, and eventually he came back to me and he said, okay, you know, when you transition out of youth ministry, you know, what area of the ministry, you know, do you want to be involved in, and can you help in? And at that time, I was always a business person. You know, I grew up as a business person from when I was young. I was always in business. And he said to me, he said, well, look, why don't you take over the business of the ministry? And at that time, it was called Diplomat Investment or something like that. And so all of his trips around the world, all of his products, the products of the ministry, we had different people who were running that. It was Pastor Jay, and then there was another couple, the Clarks and others who began running that area of ministry, being on the road with him. And eventually we agreed that I would continue to oversee the youth ministry. I would be a youth ministry consultant. I would minister in the church, in the adult ministry, but just as a speaker, not as a pastor, so to speak. And so we continued like that, and eventually the Diplomat Development and Investment Corporation became Myles Munroe International. And so I became the vice president of Myles Munroe International. So wherever he went in the world, whatever deals that he did, I was the person. So I organized the trips, I made the deals, I revamped the business model, and I ended up introducing a lot of things that changed the future of the ministry. I was actually the one who built the first website, who set up the first e-commerce. And so we went from doing no business on the internet to, at one point in time, doing maybe $750,000 a year or more on the internet. And so I was managing this operation. If he went to Australia, I would organize the trip, talk to the organizers. I would coordinate things. There were times when I would go on the trips with him. And again, I would have opportunities to share from time to time. I would meet all kinds of people. If I call the names, you'll know a lot of the names. But I was introduced to a lot of people. And we continued in ministry like that. So we were in constant contact on a daily basis, every day, exchanging emails, exchanging calls, being in meetings, having discussions. We were constantly, I guess, partners in a battle. And eventually he got more and more famous, began to travel more and more, and so we kind of drifted apart in some ways. When I say drifted apart, I was doing something, I was doing my own thing. So he was traveling around the world, and I started to travel around the world. So in addition to doing the business, I was also doing a lot of traveling. I was doing a lot of consulting. And so we began to communicate, while transversing the globe. So, I might have been calling him from Canada, or he calling me from South Africa. And, ministry just started to go on.